You won't believe some of the places I'm about to take you tonight. These aren't your usual ghost stories. These are true, unsettling encounters from abandoned shops in towns most people have forgotten ever existed. The kind of places where silence feels alive, shadows move on their own, and every creak of the floor could be someone or something watching. Before we step inside, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and share it if you dare. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from you all. Now lean in. Let's see what hides behind the dusty shelves and shattered glass. I remember driving along a stretch of road I'd never taken before, the kind that seemed to disappear into the hills if you blinked. The sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, throwing long, crooked shadows across the asphalt, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves. That's when I saw it. An old clockmaker's shop, tucked against the curve of the road like it had grown there and never left. Its windows were grimy, coated with a haze that reflected the fading light in sickly golds and browns, and the sign above the door hung at an awkward angle, creaking in the wind. I'd passed by a dozen times over the years, always curious, always warned off by the locals. They called it the Whitmore place and said things went missing there, or worse, that people who went inside didn't come out the same, or at all. But that evening, something about the way the wind rattled the old panes, or maybe just my own foolish curiosity, made me pull the car over. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. A mix of oil, dust, and something musty I couldn't place, like old leather or decaying paper. The air was thick, almost tangible, pressing against my skin in a way that made me shiver. The room was smaller than I expected, crammed full with clocks of every size and shape. Grandfather clocks towered near the corners, their pendulums swinging in uneven rhythms. Mantel clocks lined shelves, and tiny pocket watch faces glinted from a glass case in the center of the room. But what really unsettled me wasn't their age or their numbers. It was the sound. Tick, 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 1,000 clocks echoing in discord, none of them synchronized. Some ticked too fast, some too slow, some seemed to pause mid-swing, only to lurch forward as if catching up on lost time. It was dizzying, almost unbearable, and I found myself gripping the edge of a counter to stay upright. I wandered deeper, drawn by a mix of fascination and unease. I ran my fingers along the rough wood of a shelf and felt the vibration of a pendulum in motion. Then I noticed it. None of the clocks were set to any time I recognized. Not the real time, not even a pattern I could understand. Each face seemed frozen in its own world, telling a story I couldn't read. My curiosity was clawing at me, pulling me forward when I first heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible over the ticking, like someone murmuring behind the rows of clocks. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps the uneven floorboards settling. But the whisper came again, sharper this time, curling around the edges of the room and sinking into my chest. I spun around. Nothing. Just shadows stretching and bending as the dim light of the late afternoon fought through the dirty glass. My heartbeat thudded painfully in my ears, and I took a step back, brushing against the nearest clock. Its hands seemed to jump slightly as if startled, but the ticking continued in that maddeningly uneven rhythm. And then the whispers changed. They weren't whispers anymore, not entirely. They became soft cries, almost human, carrying a strange, hollow resonance that set my teeth on edge. I could feel it behind me, moving through the aisles, gliding, and though I wanted to run, my legs felt rooted, heavy as if the floor itself were swallowing me. Shadows flickered along the walls, elongating between the clocks, dancing in ways that no natural light could cause. I tried the door. Locked. I rattled the handle, the old metal groaning in protest, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flared hot in my chest, and I felt the urge to scream, but my voice stuck in my throat. That's when I realized the clocks weren't just broken. They weren't merely keeping time. They were counting something else, something I didn't understand. I looked around the room, at each face frozen in its strange, erratic rhythm, and I thought I could see numbers forming, not hours and minutes, but something else entirely, something like a countdown. A shadow moved in front of me then, but not like a person. It slithered, stretching from floor to ceiling, and for a heartbeat I could swear I saw eyes glinting in it, small and too bright, unblinking. The air grew colder, and a low vibration seemed to hum from every clock at once, pressing into my chest like a drumbeat I couldn't escape. My head spun. Every instinct screamed to get out, to run, but when I tried the door again, it refused to open. That's when the whispering, no, the crying, turned into words, though I couldn't understand them. They weren't English, at least not anything I'd heard. But the tone, the desperate pleading in the cadence, tore at me in a way that made my stomach twist. I stumbled backward, knocking into a tall grandfather clock. Its pendulum swung violently, cracking against the casing, and the sound reverberated like a gunshot. I swear the shadows flinched. In that moment, I understood something I didn't want to. Whatever lived here, or whatever had been left behind, was tied to the clocks, to the way they measured time, or perhaps measured life. I felt small, insignificant, a trespasser in a place that didn't just exist in the hills, but beyond them, beyond what I could see or reason. The ticking seemed to envelop me, and every heartbeat I felt was echoed back by the nearest clock, multiplied, distorted. I remember crouching behind a counter, trying to breathe without making a sound, listening to the room unfold around me. The shadows moved again, sliding across walls, sometimes appearing just at the corner of my eye. I thought I heard footsteps, light and careful, pacing between the ticking giants. I wanted to call out, to beg whoever or whatever it was for mercy, but my voice would not obey. It was like I had swallowed lead. The clocks ticked on, each one a hammer striking at my sense of reality. Each one reminding me that time here had its own rules, cruel and incomprehensible. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped, the shadows vanished. The clocks seemed to settle, almost gently, their ticks aligning for a fleeting second, long enough for me to see the faces clearly. I cannot describe what I saw on those dials. Not the numbers. They were normal. But something behind them, something I could feel but could not name. Something that made my skin crawl and my chest tighten as if the room itself were aware of me. Finally, the door creaked open. I bolted, sprinting into the chill evening air, my lungs burning, my heart hammering like it might burst from my chest. I didn't stop running until the shop was nothing more than a dark silhouette in the distance. Even then, I felt it. Lingering in the pit of my stomach, a thread of dread I couldn't shake. I never went back, and I never spoke of it to anyone, not in detail. People asked, of course, but I'd just shake my head and say it was an old, empty shop. Nothing more. But sometimes, when I'm driving down quiet roads near the hills, when the wind is low and the air carries a faint tang of oil and dust, I swear I hear the ticking again. And I think of those clocks, each one keeping a rhythm I cannot follow, each one marking something I was never meant to witness. I think of the shadows that slid between them and the whispers that turned into cries. And I know that somewhere in that forgotten shop, whatever was counting hasn't stopped. And maybe, one day, it will count for me too. I was driving through a town that had long since been swallowed by the hills, the kind of place that felt like it existed only because you remembered it, not because anyone actually lived there. The sun was sliding low, painting the old brick facades in dull orange light, and the streets were empty except for the wind rattling loose shutters and the occasional tumble of debris. That's when I saw it. A grocery store, tucked into a corner as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. The sign above the door read, "Hawkins Groceries," though the paint had peeled in long strips and the wood beneath looked as though it had been rotting for decades. I slowed and stared, caught somewhere between curiosity and an inexplicable sense of unease. There was something about the place, the way it leaned slightly to one side, that made it feel alive in a way I couldn't explain. I pushed open the door and a bell tinkled faintly, though it sounded hollow, almost as if it were a memory rather than a real sound. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust and the faint tang of metal and aged wood. The aisles were impossibly neat, as if someone had arranged them with obsessive care, though layers of dust suggested no one had touched a thing in years. Cans gleamed in the dim light, stacked in perfect pyramids, labels faded but aligned with uncanny precision. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a low, complaining sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the empty space. I wandered slowly, running my fingers along the shelves, half expecting a sudden collapse or some sign that the place was less abandoned than it appeared. Then I heard it, a creak from behind me, soft but deliberate. I turned sharply, my stomach tightening, and saw him. Or at least I thought it was a man. He stood just inside the shadows at the end of an aisle, unnaturally still. His face was pale, almost gray, and stretched into a smile that seemed impossible, a smile that didn't belong on a living person. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and though he didn't move toward me, there was something in the way he gestured, slow, deliberate, pointing toward the back room, that made my skin crawl. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light, some hallucination born from the dusty air and the silence, but every instinct I had screamed that he was real. Something pulled me forward, though, as if the shop itself had a voice I couldn't hear, but was obeying nonetheless. I stepped toward the back room, my feet hesitant on the old, warped floorboards. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, thick and stale, clinging to my lungs with every breath. When I finally pushed the door open, it felt like stepping into another world. The room was small, walls lined with shelving and old crates, but nothing seemed to belong. Every surface was perfectly still, untouched, yet there was an undeniable sense that the space was aware, like it was holding its breath for me. I glanced down at the floor and froze. Faint, smeared footprints led across the room, but they ended abruptly in the middle, fading into the dust as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished. I heard the softest movement behind me and turned just enough to see him again. The smile was wider now, stretching in a way that felt unnatural, a grin that seemed to mock my very presence. The shadows around him flickered. The weak light from a single bulb overhead wavered and stuttered, casting the room into brief, anxious darkness. I wanted to move, to bolt, but I felt a strange paralysis, a weight pressing down on me that made my legs feel rooted. My gut told me to run, to leave before I became a part of this place, but I couldn't turn away. There was something almost magnetic about him, about the back room, about the way the store seemed to remember me before I had even set foot inside. I stepped closer to the shelves, trying to tell myself it was a trick, that the man wasn't real, that the footprints were old, but the air was different here. It carried a memory, or perhaps an intention. Every breath felt thick, pressing down, and the faint sound of scratching began, coming from somewhere behind the walls. It wasn't loud. Just a whisper, a rhythm that seemed deliberate, like fingernails tracing a line I couldn't see. I looked around desperately, searching for a source, but the room was empty, aside from the shelves, the crates, and the man who still watched, still smiled. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows seemed to surge forward, stretching, curling, not quite touching, but close enough to make my skin prickle. My heart hammered, and I realized I could hear the faintest breath, a soft exhale that wasn't my own. I spun toward the door, ready to run, but it wouldn't move. My hands shook as I tried the handle, rattling it violently, and finally, with a metallic groan, it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, heart racing, and when I looked back, the man was gone. The back room was empty, still, and yet it felt as though it was waiting, patient, keeping watch. I ran through the aisles, my steps echoing in the hollow space, and out the front door into the fading sunlight. The town was quiet, unnervingly so, and the wind had picked up, tossing leaves and scraps of paper across the empty streets. I didn't slow down until my car was in sight, parked exactly where I had left it, as if nothing had happened. The shop sat behind me, crooked, silent, but it felt alive in a way I couldn't place. Like it knew me now, like it had marked me. I drove away, keeping my eyes on the road, but even as the town faded behind me, I could feel that pull, the memory of the man's smile, the cold weight of the air, the lingering sense of being watched. I never returned. I don't speak of it often. I tell myself it was a trick of exhaustion or a combination of shadows and sunlight. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind presses against the windows in just the right way, I can hear the faint creak of a door and the whisper of footsteps behind me. I can see that smile in my mind, stretched too wide, and I remember the footprints leading nowhere. I'll never know what I saw that day, or why the shop seemed to remember me. All I know is that there are places in the hills that are alive in ways you cannot measure, and some memories aren't yours alone. They belong to the building, to the shadows, to the things that linger long after the doors have closed. Hawkins Groceries sits somewhere in my mind like a splinter, small but persistent, and I feel its presence whenever I pass quiet towns, abandoned buildings, or streets swallowed by the forest. I don't know if it's waiting, or if it already has what it wanted, but I know one thing. I can't erase it. I can't forget that smile, the perfect stillness of the back room, or the footprints that led nowhere. And somehow, even now, I feel it watching, patient just beyond the edge of memory. The town barely existed in any way that mattered. I'd been driving for hours through rain that came down in thin, steady sheets, the kind that soaks everything without making much noise. The road narrowed until it felt more like a suggestion than a proper highway, curling through low hills and wet forest. When I finally saw the lights, there were only a handful, one gas pump under a flickering bulb, a diner already dark, and a barber shop with a dim glow behind its front window. I don't know why I stopped there. Maybe it was the fatigue settling into my bones, or the way the rain seemed heavier everywhere else. The sign just said "Barber" in peeling white letters, and something about its stubborn presence felt reassuring in a place that otherwise felt forgotten. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. Must, old wood, damp cloth, and something faintly metallic underneath, like rust or old blood you couldn't quite place. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the door closed behind me with a soft, final click that sounded louder than it should have. The shop was small, narrow and deep, with a single barber chair in the center and a long counter running along the right wall. The lights were low, yellowed with age, casting shadows that seemed to cling to the corners. The rain tapped softly against the window, steady and patient. The barber stood behind the chair as if he'd been there the whole time, though I hadn't heard him move. He was an old man, thin, with shoulders slightly hunched and hair the color of dirty snow. His face was mostly hidden by the angle of the light, his eyes sunk deep into shadow. He didn't smile or greet me, just nodded once, slow and deliberate. Something about that nod made my stomach tighten, but I brushed it off. In small towns, people often didn't waste words on strangers. I sat in the chair, shrugging out of my jacket, feeling foolish for being uneasy. The vinyl seat was cracked and cold through my clothes. The barber lifted the cape and draped it over me with a practiced motion. His hands were dry and cool, lingering for just a second longer than necessary at my neck. I remember thinking how quiet the place was. Not peaceful quiet, but expectant, like the pause before a question is answered. That was when I noticed the mirror. It was large, nearly covering the wall in front of me, framed in dark wood that had been worn smooth by decades of hands. At first, everything seemed normal. I saw myself, tired and pale, rain still clinging to my hair. I saw the barber behind me, his outline blurred by the dim light. But then I caught something else, just at the edge of the reflection. A movement, a bend of shadow where there shouldn't have been one. I blinked and focused harder, telling myself it was just the lighting or my eyes adjusting. The rain outside shifted. The light flickered slightly, and the reflection steadied. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it happened again. A shape, low and indistinct, slipping along the bottom edge of the mirror, as if something had moved behind me that I hadn't heard. I turned my head, cape rustling softly, and looked back into the shop. There was nothing there. Just the counter, cluttered with jars of combs and scissors, and the closed door behind it that I hadn't noticed before. Plain, wooden, its paint worn thin. I faced the mirror again. My heart beat a little faster now. The barber began to move, reaching for his tools. I watched him in the reflection, though his face never fully came into focus. Every time I tried to look directly at his eyes, my gaze slid away, as if the mirror itself resisted. The scissors never touched my hair. Instead, he stood there, hands resting lightly on the counter, watching me watch myself. The shapes returned, clearer this time. They seemed to press inward from the edges of the mirror, bending the reflection in subtle ways. The shop behind me looked deeper in the glass than it felt in reality, shadows stretching where they shouldn't. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, a cold awareness that I wasn't alone in the way I'd assumed. I should probably just... I started, my voice sounding thin and out of place. The barber leaned closer, his breath faintly smelling of tobacco and something sour. He spoke softly, barely above the whisper of the rain. "It shows what's behind the door you can't open." I let out a nervous laugh before I could stop myself. It came out wrong, brittle. "That's so?" I said, trying to sound amused. "Guess I don't need to see that." He didn't respond. He just straightened and stepped back, his reflection blurring again. The mirror changed. It wasn't sudden, not like a jump scare or a trick of light. It was gradual, like an image coming into focus after being out of frame. The shadows at the edges sharpened, taking on shape and depth. I could see the counter more clearly now, every scratch in the wood, every stain. And then I saw the figure. It was crouched low behind the counter, pressed close to the floor, its limbs folded in a way that looked painful and wrong. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over thin bones. The eyes are what held me. Too bright, too aware. They stared straight at me through the glass, unblinking, filled with a hunger that felt intimate, personal, as if it knew me or knew something about me I'd never said aloud. I tried to look away. I really did. My eyes burned, tears forming, but every time I closed them or turned my head, the reflection dragged me back. The mirror felt heavy, like it had weight beyond glass and wood, pulling at me. "Who is that?" I whispered, though I already knew the barber wouldn't answer. The figure shifted, just slightly. Its mouth opened, and I thought I heard something beneath the rain and the hum of the lights. A sound like breathing through a narrow space. Like someone trapped where there wasn't enough air. The barber finally moved again, stepping to my side. I could feel him there, solid and real, even as the mirror showed something that shouldn't have been. He placed a hand on my shoulder, light but firm. Not who, he murmured. What stays? I don't remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet, the cape slipping to the floor. My legs felt weak, rubbery, but fear carried me forward. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as it closed around the knob. For one terrible second, it didn't turn. I thought of the door behind the counter, of what the mirror had shown me, and panic surged. Then the knob gave, and I stumbled out into the rain. The air outside felt shockingly clean, cold and sharp in my lungs. I stood there for a long moment, bent over, hands on my knees, listening to the rain and my own ragged breathing. When I looked back, the barber shop window was dark. No light, no movement, just my own reflection staring back at me, pale and shaken. I got in my car and drove away without looking back again. It wasn't until much later, hours down the road, that I realized something felt wrong. Not physically exactly. Lighter, like I'd left something behind without noticing. A weight I'd carried for so long, I'd stopped being aware of it. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a quiet, aching dread. Sometimes, in old shops or roadside diners, I catch my reflection in a mirror and feel that same pull, that same sense of being seen from the other side. I don't linger anymore. I don't trust what reflections might choose to show me. And every so often, when I'm alone and it's quiet enough, I swear I can feel eyes on me. Waiting, patient, as if something is still crouched just out of sight, holding on to the part of me that never came back. I remember driving through the Appalachian foothills one late afternoon, the sky low and gray, pressing down on the ridges and valleys like it wanted to squeeze the world into itself. The road was narrow, twisting, lined with thick stands of trees that swayed in the chill wind, their bare branches rattling like brittle bones. I had been following a map that led me to a town I'd never heard of, one that seemed to shrink the further I went. By the time I reached it, the streets were empty, houses dark and shuttered, a few cars abandoned and half covered in moss. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't just lull you. It grips you, makes your ears ring, makes every footstep sound like a shout in a canyon. That's when I saw it. A toy store, its windows faintly glowing despite the apparent emptiness around it. The glow wasn't warm. It was unnatural, a pale amber that seemed almost to pulse. I should have driven past, I know that now, but something in me, curiosity, recklessness, maybe both, made me pull up and step out. The door creaked when I pushed it, and the little bell above jingled, but not like a normal bell. It had a hollow, lingering sound, like it was echoing from somewhere deeper than the store itself. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. A mix of old varnish, wax, and something cloying, almost sweet, that made my stomach tighten. The place was spotless, impossibly so, as if no one had ever entered in decades. Shelves lined the walls, stuffed with toys that should have been long ruined, dolls with porcelain faces, plush animals, wind-up soldiers, all in perfect condition. Their eyes were too bright, too still, and I felt, almost instantly, like they were watching me. I tried to shake the thought off, telling myself it was the way my shadow moved across their faces, but it didn't help. I wandered further in, each step muffled on the scuffed wooden floor. A wind-up toy soldier tumbled slightly when I passed, but before I could bend down to right it, I realized it had stopped moving. The doll's eyes seemed to track me, glassy and wide, and the deeper I went, the more I noticed that nothing was scattered or left to chance. Every toy faced the same direction, toward the back of the store. Even the dolls that had been sitting in chairs or on shelves were positioned deliberately, as though arranged by invisible hands. I felt my pulse pick up, my skin prickling. There was a melody then, soft, tinkling, impossibly sweet, coming from somewhere near the counter. I froze, There was no one behind it, yet the tune continued, looping endlessly from a music box I hadn't touched. I tried to move, to convince myself it was just a clever setup, a storekeeper's way of keeping appearances, but the air had changed. It was heavy, almost solid, pressing in on my shoulders, filling my lungs with its weight. My hands shook as I reached for the nearest shelf for balance. Then I saw it. A doll sitting neatly on a shelf about 10 feet away, smiling faintly. Its head tilted as if listening, its painted lips curling just enough to feel deliberate. I swear, every time I looked away, it had inched closer, though the floor between us was empty. My rational mind screamed that I was imagining it, that I had been on the road too long, that the wind outside had gotten into my head. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't imagination. The store seemed to notice me noticing it. The other toys, the plush animals, the wooden soldiers, even the tiny plastic figurines, shifted ever so slightly in a synchronized rhythm. Their eyes glimmered in the dim light, reflecting it back at me, unblinking, accusing. I tried to take a step back, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The music box's melody grew louder, looping, insistent, almost mocking. I realized then that the store wasn't merely abandoned, it was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. It had a pulse, a will, and for reasons I couldn't understand, it wanted me to stay. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. I forced myself toward the door, telling myself that I had to get out, that this was just a nightmare I'd wandered into. But the shelves seemed to stretch, elongate, narrowing the aisle, making the store feel larger, deeper, endless. That same doll, the one smiling faintly, was closer now. Its glassy eyes met mine directly, unflinching. I could feel it observing me, testing me, and an instinctive fear rose in me that left my knees weak. I reached the door handle and yanked. It budged slightly, but something unseen seemed to hold it back. My heart was hammering, my ears ringing with the melody, with the faint scrape of toys moving on shelves. The bell jingled again, though I hadn't touched the door. A shadow passed near the counter, or maybe it was a trick of the dim light, but I swear I caught the movement of something small and human-like, hunched, shuffling. I didn't wait to question it. I pulled with all my strength, twisting the handle, and finally the door gave way. The instant I stepped out, rain was lashing down, cold and heavy, soaking me instantly. The sound of the door slamming behind me echoed in the empty street, and for a moment I thought I heard the faint, distant melody carried by the wind, as if the store itself were mourning my departure. I ran, slipping on the wet asphalt, my shoes squelching against puddles. I didn't stop until the glow of the toy store disappeared behind the mist in the trees. Even then, I kept looking back, half expecting the windows to flicker again, the smiling doll to appear at the doorway. I didn't speak of it, not to anyone. People asked why I'd looked so shaken when I returned to town, and I mumbled something about the weather, about being lost. But I've never forgotten that smile, or the way the toys were arranged, like an army waiting, patient and silent, all facing the same direction, toward some place I couldn't see. Since that night, I've caught myself thinking about it in quiet moments, when the wind rattles my windows or when I drive down isolated back roads. Sometimes I swear I hear the faint tinkle of a music box, faint but insistent, and my chest tightens as if I've returned to that shop without ever moving. I think of the doll, still smiling, still watching, and I realize that some things aren't meant to be explained. Some places aren't meant to be entered, and some sights, no matter how brief, stay with you forever, leaving a quiet, gnawing dread that no amount of distance can erase. Even now, I can close my eyes and picture the rows of toys, each one facing the same direction, waiting. And I know that somewhere, in the shadows of that long-forgotten store, that smile is still waiting for me, too. I remember the first time I stumbled upon that butcher shop like it happened yesterday, though it's been yours. I had been driving down one of those forgotten back roads in the Appalachians, the kind where the trees crowd so close you can barely see the sky, and the only sound is your own tires crunching over broken asphalt. I was chasing the last light of day, hoping to find a place to pull over, maybe a small diner, but the town I turned into had been swallowed by time. Houses leaned in odd angles, windows gaping like empty eyes, and the streets were littered with rusted cars and shattered glass. That's when I saw it. A swinging sign, blackened and chipped, rocking in the wind like a metronome. It read, "Miller's Butcher Shop," though the paint was barely legible. The sign creaked against the frame, and the sound carried across the empty street, strange and loud in the silence. Something about it drew me in, though I didn't understand why. The door was ajar, and a chill hit me the instant I crossed the threshold. The smell was the first thing that struck me. Iron, decay, something old, deep, and unmistakably rotten. My boots clicked against the wooden floor, and I noticed the hooks dangling from the ceiling. They were rusted, long abandoned, but certain ones caught what little light filtered through the grimy windows. They gleamed in a way that didn't make sense, as if someone had polished them yesterday. The walls were smeared with dark stains, and the counters were coated in dust and cobwebs. But there was a subtle familiarity to it all, a memory I couldn't place. My chest tightened, a vague, inexplicable dread creeping up my spine. On the counter, a cleaver lay as if waiting for me. Its metal looked worn but sharp, and there was something in its placement that felt deliberate, like a warning or an invitation. I reached out, almost against my own better judgment, and when my fingers brushed the handle, I felt it vibrate slightly, almost like a pulse. Then it came, the thud, slow, deliberate, from the back room. My stomach knotted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. Yet nothing answered me. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift with the fading light, and the hooks above me clinked softly, as if whispering. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or maybe my imagination, but the sound had a rhythm, an almost human cadence. I lifted the cleaver, holding it in front of me like a shield, though I knew it was useless. That's when I noticed it. The cleaver moved. Just slightly, an imperceptible twitch, like it had a mind of its own. Panic clawed at my throat. I dropped it, and it landed upright on the counter, blade sinking into the wood with a dull thud. My eyes were drawn to the metal, and that's when I saw them. Tiny scratches etched across the blade, forming letters. My letters. My name, over and over, carved into the steel. I staggered back, heart hammering, my breaths loud in the suffocating air. I ran. I didn't look back, though I could hear the whispers, soft and deliberate, threading through the empty streets behind me. It wasn't just wind or the echo of my own footsteps. They carried a rhythm, like someone speaking in low tones just beyond comprehension, coaxing me, calling me. I kept running, adrenaline propelling me through broken streets and overgrown sidewalks, until the town disappeared behind me like a bad dream fading in the dawn. It took me a while to make sense of it, and even now, thinking back, it doesn't feel like something that belongs entirely to this world. Later, I realized the scratches on the cleaver weren't random. They were deliberate, obsessive, a signature of attention I couldn't comprehend. The letters formed my name, and it was almost as if the shop itself had noticed me, marked me, and wouldn't let me forget. There was a sense of recognition there, a twisted familiarity, like I had been inside that room before, though I had no memory of it. The thing that haunts me the most isn't the cleaver or the shop itself, but the way the shadows moved. They weren't cast by the sun, and they weren't just tricks of light. They seemed to occupy the air, leaning close, observing, waiting. I remember glimpsing them shift behind the hooks, and the shape felt human enough to recognize. But wrong. Stiff, jerky, and too thin. Not quite a person, not quite a thing, just watching. I've never been able to explain it. That town, that building, it exists in some place outside normal rules. There's a weight there, a pressure in the air that tells you things don't belong in the light, things are better left alone. I've gone back in my mind countless times, trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was some kind of trap left by whoever abandoned the town, some prank gone sour, or maybe just my own mind turning loneliness into terror. But the scratches on that cleaver, spelling my name over and over, are real. I've touched that blade in memory, traced the lines with my fingers, and the cold bites into me even now. I've tried to tell people, friends, family, but they just shake their heads, saying I must have dreamed it, that old towns can play tricks on your mind. But I know the truth. Something in that shop wanted me to know it saw me, that it remembered me, and that it was patient enough to wait for me to find it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear the whispers again. They don't make sense, but they carry the same rhythm as that thud from the back room. And I remember the moment the cleaver moved in my hand, how the shadows leaned closer, almost welcoming me, almost daring me. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden. It was subtle, careful, the kind of movement that makes you doubt your own senses, yet your instincts scream the truth. I never went back to that town, though I've driven past its location more than once, hoping to find some sign that it was just an illusion. Each time, the road stretches empty, lined with thick trees that seem to lean in, hiding the town from the world. No sign, no broken windows, nothing, like it had never existed. And yet, I still feel it. In quiet moments, when the wind rattles the windows or the darkness feels too heavy, I swear I can see the shape of hooks swinging, feel the pull of the cleaver in my palm, and hear whispers brushing against my ears. I've learned to avoid thinking about it, but memory is a strange thing. Even now, when I try to recall the shape of that back room, the smell of iron, the way the light caught the rusted hooks, it's vivid, detailed, and wrong. My own mind betrays me, and yet I can't forget. That shop, that place, it left something inside me, a mark that doesn't fade. I can still feel it sometimes, as though a part of me stayed behind in the shadows, in the whispering air, in the slow, deliberate thud of something moving just beyond sight. Even years later, I sometimes wonder if I was lucky to leave it all. That cleaver wasn't just a tool. It wasn't just a piece of metal left behind by someone long gone. It was a message, a warning, and maybe even a claim. And the town, if it still exists somewhere out there in the mountains, waiting under the thick canopy of trees, might still be watching. Waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander in, the next curious soul to brush against the hooks, to touch the cleaver, to hear the thud from the back room and wonder if they were meant to leave at all. I don't know why it singled me out. I don't know why it remembered me, but I do know that sometimes, when the wind howls across an empty road and the trees lean too close, I hear a faint creak, like a sign swinging in the distance, and I feel that same pulse in my chest, that same pull of iron and decay, reminding me that some places in Appalachia aren't abandoned. They're waiting, they're watching, and they don't forget. I never meant to find that town. I was chasing a curiosity, the kind you can't explain, except that something about the forest roads that day whispered at me, pulling me further than I should have gone. The sun was already low, slanting through the bare trees and painting the asphalt with streaks of orange and gray, when I noticed the first row of buildings. They were old, the kind you see in pictures of towns that died decades ago. paint peeled in long curls, windows either smashed or clouded with grime, and signs sagged like they were too tired to stay upright. I parked along the cracked curb, the tires crunching against scattered glass and leaves, and the silence hit me first. No birds, no wind stirring the branches, just the quiet, deep enough to press against my eardrums. That's when I saw it. A small pharmacy tucked between a shuttered diner and a collapsing hardware store. Its glass door was fractured, a jagged line across the center, and a bell hung crookedly above the threshold. The second I stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for years. Dust floated in hazy beams of late afternoon light, drifting lazily from the ceiling to the floor. I coughed once, low and sharp, and the sound bounced back at me. Empty. The aisles were narrow, lined with shelves of medicine bottles that had long ago surrendered their usefulness. Most labels were faded beyond recognition, but some clung stubbornly to what little detail remained. A few had shattered entirely, their contents seeping into dark, almost oily stains on the linoleum. The smell hit me next, a mixture of mildew, rust, and something metallic underneath that I couldn't place. I had the strangest sensation that I wasn't alone, though no one answered when I whispered, "Hello." I moved deeper into the store, my boots crunching against broken glass and a few fallen packages. That's when I saw it, a figure behind the counter. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, some old display left to gather dust. But the way it sat, still, silent, almost unnaturally calm, made my stomach twist. Its head was bowed, shadowed, and for a long moment I couldn't tell if it was even breathing. I stepped closer, voice tighter than I wanted it to be, asking if anyone was there, if anyone had been here recently. There was nothing. Not a twitch, not a shuffle. Not a sound at all beyond the subtle hiss of dust disturbed by my movement. The hairs on my neck rose, tiny shocks of fear crawling down my spine. Then the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air now, hanging like smoke before dissipating. The shadows shifted around me, stretching across the walls and curving into shapes that made my stomach tighten. I swear, for a second, I thought one of the shadows moved independently, sliding along the floor before curling back toward the shelves. Panic fluttered in my chest, and I turned, intending to retrace my steps and leave. But the aisle I had entered through, the door I had pushed open, was gone. In its place was another row of shelves, packed with small white boxes and bottles I didn't recognize. The labels were unfamiliar, names that didn't exist, and some seemed to shimmer faintly in the dusty light. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of perspective, my mind playing games in the oppressive quiet, but as I moved, the floor seemed to shift beneath me. Crates that hadn't been there before now cluttered the narrow aisle. My foot caught on one, sending me stumbling forward, arms flailing to steady myself against shelves that rattled ominously with the touch. I could feel something watching, though I couldn't see it. A presence that made my skin crawl and my heart hammer against my ribs like it wanted to escape. The figure behind the counter didn't move, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge me at all, yet I felt it in my chest, heavy and patient. I ran, blindly, tripping over boxes and glass fragments, the smell of rot growing stronger with each step. My hands scraped along the edges of shelves, leaving streaks in the thick dust. The aisles seemed endless, twisting impossibly, the exit never coming. I could hear my own breath in ragged bursts, echoing back at me from walls that shouldn't have been there. It was as though the store itself had become alive, its layout rearranging to trap me, to test me, to make me lose myself in it. Every turn I took led me deeper, the labels on the bottles mocking my confusion, names twisting into symbols my brain refused to interpret. Eventually, my momentum carried me toward a side door I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a leaning shelf. I flung it open and fell onto the cracked sidewalk outside, gasping, knees scraped and palms bleeding from the fall. The street was quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels normal until you notice it's too perfect. My chest heaving, I turned to look back at the pharmacy. My stomach sank. The building was no longer the abandoned nightmare I had fled. Its windows were clear, the door unbroken, the shelves perfectly organized and stocked as if someone had been maintaining it daily. There was no dust, no shadows, no dark stains, and certainly no figure behind the counter. Just a clean, normal pharmacy that could have been on any small Appalachian main street. I told myself it was a hallucination, the result of too much sun, isolation, and the thrill of exploring abandoned places. But even as I walked away, the memory of that still figure, the cold, the shifting aisles, and the smell of spilled medicine lingered like a stain on my mind. That night, in the little cabin I rented nearby, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the walls, every whisper of wind in the trees outside sounded to me like the floorboards of that pharmacy, twisting and moving, waiting. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just stress, that forgotten towns have a way of getting under your skin, but my dreams betrayed me. In the dark, I would wake to the sound of glass shattering, the faint hiss of something spilling onto tile, and the shadowed figure sitting just at the edge of my vision. I never saw it clearly in the dreams, only that bowed head, unmoving, patient. Sometimes I would wake and catch a glimpse of white bottles on my nightstand, only to blink and find nothing. It didn't matter how I rationalized it. My body remembered the cold, my mind remembered the rearranging aisles, and my heart remembered the impossible sense of being hunted without ever seeing the hunter. Weeks later, I returned to that stretch of forest road, hoping to confront the memory, to prove that the town, the pharmacy, had been real, or at least abandoned like it should have been. But the road seemed to avoid me, turning into ruts and trees as if it never wanted to show me that place again. When I asked locals, they insisted no such town existed there. No pharmacy, no diner, nothing but forest and old abandoned fields. Some of them frowned when I pressed further, their eyes darting to the tree line, whispering about the places that move, or stores that shouldn't be. I drove away, more unsettled than before, because now I wasn't just afraid. I was certain that what I had experienced hadn't been a trick of my own imagination, but something else, something patient, something that could manipulate space, time, memory, and perception to keep me trapped inside that pharmacy for as long as it wanted. Even now, months later, I sometimes drive past small towns, scanning for pharmacies with cracked glass or dusty shelves, my heart hammering with the memory. I can't explain why I do it, but I know I'll recognize that feeling the moment it returns. The air too cold, the shadows stretching, the smell of spilled medicine, and the impossible stillness of a figure waiting, head bowed behind the counter. I haven't seen it again, at least not physically, but I carry it with me. The idea that a place could exist, fully alive, entirely indifferent, and yet intent on testing me, staying in the periphery of my vision, just beyond comprehension. It's a thought that clings to the back of my mind whenever I'm alone in the dark, whenever I hear a creak or a hiss that doesn't belong. And I know, deep down, that if I ever stepped too far down those forest roads again, I wouldn't find a town, a pharmacy, or a figure. I would find only the infinite twisting of reality, patient and unmoving, waiting for me to stumble through its aisles once more. I still remember the moment I burst into the street, legs trembling, palms scraped, lungs burning. And I remember the second I dared to look back. A perfect, innocent little pharmacy, quiet and clean, pretending it had never been abandoned at all. The image is burned into my memory, and sometimes, when the night is still and the wind is gone, I swear I can hear the bottles rattling faintly, as though someone or something behind the counter is moving them just out of reach, watching, patient, waiting for me to return. I remember the morning like it was pressing against my eyes, heavy and thick. The fog had come down so fast that it was like driving through a wall, everything ahead of me dissolving into white. My truck's headlights barely cut through it, the beams scattering uselessly, turning the world into a blur of silver and gray. That's when I saw it, a general store appearing from the mist as though it had grown there overnight. Its shape was haphazard, like it had been stitched together from scraps, and the dim glow from a single flickering bulb above the door was weak, barely holding back the fog's suffocating embrace. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles ached, but the cold and damp gnawing at my skin pushed me forward. The bell above the door rang sharply as I stepped inside, an unexpected sound that seemed far too alive for a place so still. The store was silent, not just quiet, but a kind of hollow silence that filled your ears with its own pressure. Dust motes floated in the weak light, catching on the edges of the shelves, which groaned under the weight of jars and cans that looked decades old. Nothing seemed familiar. Labels were faded, and some objects were entirely unidentifiable, as if they had been harvested from some corner of the world I'd never seen. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and smelled of damp wood and something older, something that made the back of my throat itch. I took a step further, while the wooden floorboards complained under my weight, the creak echoing like a warning. Then I saw him. The man behind the counter appeared without a sound, as if he had been there the entire time, a part of the shadows themselves. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and the dim light caught in his eyes in a way that was wrong, like they reflected the room's emptiness rather than light. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I tried again, asking where I was, or what town this was, but he said nothing. He only raised a thin, veined hand and gestured vaguely toward the back of the store. I felt an almost physical pull, a weight pressing at my chest, urging me forward, and despite my better judgment, I followed. As I moved deeper into the store, the fog followed. It seeped through the doorway and drifted around my legs, cold and wet, curling up past my knees, then to my waist. It carried a faint smell of rot, like fallen leaves damp in a forest long abandoned. Shapes seemed to move in the periphery, shadows that weren't shadows, limbs that shifted and then vanished when I looked straight at them. My heart was hammering, but the air itself seemed to hold me there, pushing me forward into the unknown. The shelves here were even stranger, twisted wood, warped by age, covered in jars that rattled faintly as if something alive lurked inside. I don't know why I kept going. I can't explain the force that made my feet move as my mind screamed at me to turn back. At one point, I stumbled over a crate that had been hidden in the fog. The sound was deafening, bouncing through the store like a gunshot in an empty canyon. The man was there, still silent, still watching, and then I noticed it. His eyes weren't just reflecting the dim light, they were reflecting me. Every small movement, every flicker of fear, mirrored back with a patience that was terrifying. I tried to speak again, to demand answers, but the sound stuck in my throat. All he did was nod slightly, just enough to send me further into that hallway of fog and warped shelves. The fog thickened until I could barely see my own hands. I could feel it pressing against my chest, weighing down my lungs, and I heard the faintest rustle of movement all around me. There were whispers, or maybe the wind through some hidden crack, something low and guttural that seemed to speak in a language I didn't understand. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, shifting like the trees outside. But there were no windows here, only the fog curling against wood and glass. A wanted to run, but every step I tried felt slowed, as if the store itself was resisting me, bending the air, tugging me towards some place I didn't want to go. At last, I reached what I assumed was the back room. It was darker, the fog nearly solid now, and there was a coldness that wasn't just in the air but in my bones. I thought I saw figures, hunched over, crouching, whispering to each other without sound. I spun around to leave, heart hammering, but the aisle I'd walked down seemed longer than before, the shelves stretching farther than they should have. The man was nowhere to be seen, yet I felt his gaze still on me, a weight on the back of my neck that made my skin crawl. Panic finally took hold, and I ran, slipping through the fog, feeling unseen hands brush against my shoulders, the air thick and viscous, pulling at me like water. When I burst through the front door, the fog hit me like a wall, but it was different, less oppressive, almost retreating. I ran to my truck, fumbling with the keys, my legs shaking so hard I thought I'd collapse. I turned the engine over, and the headlights cut through the mist again, but the world outside had changed. The town I'd passed through on the way in, the road, the houses, the familiar landmarks, none of it was there. The general store, the one I had been inside just moments ago, was gone, as if it had never existed. Only the faint smell of dust and old wood lingered in the morning air, clinging to me, clinging to the truck like a shadow I couldn't shake. I drove on, still in that dense fog, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination. But the shapes, the whispers, the unnatural pull, I can still feel them pressing against my mind. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see that store, those shelves, the man with the eyes that reflected more than light, more than me. And I know that somewhere, just beyond the reach of my headlights, it waits. Not for me, exactly, but for someone else who might wander through the morning fog, looking for a place that isn't there, a place that wants you to follow. I've tried to tell people what happened, but they always look at me like I'm crazy. Roads don't just disappear, stores don't vanish, and men don't move like shadows. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick over the hills, I swear I can hear the bell above that door, creaking just faintly, calling for someone else. And it terrifies me more than I can ever say, because I know it could have kept me there forever if I hadn't run. I can't explain why I did, only that I did. And now I live with the sense that whatever I encountered is still out there, watching, waiting, patient. The fog never truly leaves the memory, not for someone who has walked through it, not for someone who has followed the pull into the quiet, cold heart of something that shouldn't exist. Even now, I check the fog when it rolls in. I never drive through it the same way again. And every creak of a floorboard, every faint whisper in the wind, every smell of old wood and dust, it brings me right back to that place. I can still feel the cold pressing against my chest, the shapes slipping just out of view, and the sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the place itself. I don't know if anyone else would ever see it. Maybe that's the way it's meant to be. A memory, a warning, a secret buried in the hills, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to follow the fog into the quiet. I think about the man sometimes, pale and still, and I wonder what he saw reflected in my eyes. Was he a guardian, a prisoner, or just part of the fog itself? Patient, eternal? I'll never know. And that's the worst part, the not knowing, the sense that some questions are meant to remain unanswered. The fog, the store, the town that never existed. It all lingers, and I know somewhere out there, it waits again. I was wandering the edges of town late that afternoon, the kind of streets the city seems to forget exist. The pavement was cracked, weeds sprouting through every gap, and the sun hung low, casting long shadows that made everything feel half alive. That's when I saw it. a narrow alley wedged between two brick buildings that I could swear I'd passed 100 times before. But today, something had changed. A small bookstore sat there, pressed tight between its neighbors, its windows darkened, almost as if the glass itself was holding its breath. The door stood slightly ajar, swinging with a faint creak every time the wind stirred, and it drew me in against the better sense I'd cultivated walking through strange, forgotten corners of the city. The moment I stepped inside, the air hit me like a wall. It was heavy, damp, and carried that distinct scent of old paper mingled with mildew. Dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering from a single grimy window at the back, catching just enough to make the shadows crawl across the shelves. The room was small, cramped even, but packed with books stacked tightly on shelves that reached toward the low ceiling. What unsettled me most wasn't the clutter. It was the way the books seemed arranged, almost deliberately, as if someone had handled each one carefully, placed it exactly where they wanted me to find it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being guided, like some unseen presence had meticulously prepared this place for me. As I wandered deeper, the shadows pooled thicker in the corners, bending against the weak light. I could feel movement just beyond my vision, a flicker at the edge of a shelf, a rustle as if someone or something was pacing silently. My heart started hammering, but the voice came before I could decide whether to run. A whisper, soft, fragile, barely more than breath, drifted through the stacks. It didn't belong to anyone I could see. "Come, sit," it seemed to say. I followed it, my feet moving faster than my mind. At the back of the store, I found a small nook, almost hidden. A single chair faced the wall, and beside it, a low stack of books. I hesitated for a long moment before sliding onto the chair, my hands brushing against the cracked leather of the seat. Instantly, the whisper stopped, and an oppressive stillness filled the space. That's when I noticed it, the weight of eyes on me. I spun, but the nook was empty. No one, not a soul. My breathing hitched. Every book I touched seemed to tremble slightly in my hands, faintly, like a heartbeat too slow to be real. My fingers shook as I put them back on the shelf. Time began to stretch. The longer I lingered, the more the room seemed to shift around me. I felt my own thoughts start to leak away, subtle at first, like water through cracks, until memories that weren't mine started seeping in. I could feel them, waking up in rooms I'd never seen, voices calling my name in places I'd never been, faces staring at me from corners I'd never imagined. Each book I opened seemed to pull another fragment from somewhere else, stitching me into stories I had no right to know. A life that wasn't mine, lived somewhere between the pages. And then I realized I couldn't tell what was my own memory anymore. The shadows started to breathe along with me, and every sound in the shop, creaks, faint whispers, the occasional thump of a book falling felt deliberate, as though the building itself were alive and aware. I tried to focus, tried to anchor myself in the world outside the bookstore, but the memories pressed harder, spilling over the edges of my mind, demanding to be acknowledged. I felt myself slipping, and panic finally set in. I bolted, throwing myself from the chair and rushing through the narrow aisles. Books shook and rattled in their places. Shelves groaned as if reaching toward me, and the whispering followed, growing more insistent, almost frantic, layered with a desperation that pressed into my chest with each step. I burst through the doorway into the alley, my lungs burning, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I'd just experienced. And then I looked back. The bookstore was gone. The narrow alley was empty. Just the same cracked pavement, weeds pushing through the seams, and the low sinking sun painting everything in long shadows. I spun in a slow circle, desperate to find some trace of it, some sign that it had been real. But there was nothing. No brick or mortar, no faint scent of old paper, no whisper carried on the wind. I stumbled down the street, heart racing, still tasting the damp, paper-heavy air on my tongue, trying to explain it to myself. Maybe it was a hallucination, some trick of heat and shadows. Maybe someone had played an elaborate prank. But every time I close my eyes, I can feel those eyes on me again. The room, the chair, the trembling books, they are burned into my mind. And the worst part is this. Some nights I hear the whisper again, soft and desperate. And I know it isn't a memory, it isn't in my head, it's waiting somewhere. I've tried to tell people about it, to warn them. Friends, family, strangers if they look curious enough, but the words fail. They think I'm exaggerating, or worse, imagining things. I can't blame them. It sounds impossible, like something out of a bad story, but I've learned to recognize the moments before it happens again. The sudden chill, the corner of my eye catching movement that isn't there, the faint smell of mildew and old paper in the middle of the city. When it comes, it doesn't announce itself with doors slamming or screams. It slips in like a shadow that knows my name. I've avoided streets that feel forgotten, alleys wedged tight between buildings, anything that looks like it could vanish if I blink. But it doesn't matter. The memory has a way of catching me anyway. In quiet moments, when I sit too long in one place, I start to feel that pull, subtle at first, like a finger tracing the outline of my thoughts. I see the chair, the nook, the trembling books. I hear the whisper. I feel those eyes on me again, pressing from somewhere just beyond the corner of my mind. I sometimes wonder if it was real, if I imagined it entirely, or if the city itself has its own dark corners that swallow people for reasons they can't explain. But I know the truth deep down. I know that something was in that bookstore, waiting, watching, choosing. And I know I came back changed, so even if I don't remember all of what was taken from me. The strangest part is this. I still think about going back. Not to the spot where it once was. That street is empty. But to follow the pull, to see if I can find it again. Part of me wants to confront it, to understand it, even though every rational thought screams that I shouldn't. Because if it's real, if it's still out there, I'm afraid of what might happen if it decides to welcome me in again. Even now I can feel it in quiet corners of the city, in abandoned shops, in alleys that look too narrow to hold a shadow. Sometimes, when I think I'm alone, I hear it. That soft, desperate whisper, and it doesn't ask for much. Just for me to sit down, just for me to stay a while. And I know that if I do, I might never leave again. I'll never forget the way the books trembled in my hands, the weight of eyes on me, the memories that weren't mine. And I'll never forget the way the world looked when I ran out, sunlight stretching across the empty street, the sense that something had been erased, leaving only me behind, trying to make sense of the impossible. That's the thing about certain encounters in forgotten places. They don't end when you walk away. They follow you. They change you. And sometimes, late at night, you realize that the thing you ran from is still inside you, whispering, waiting, patient as stone. It's been years since that day, but I still hear the whispers. I still see shadows moving just out of reach. And I know if I ever let my guard down, if I ever wander down the wrong street or notice a door that's slightly ajar, I might find that bookstore again, and this time, it might not let me leave.